The artillery shell screams overhead, and Guardsman Melos doesn't even flinch anymore. He keeps stirring the massive pot of grey sludge that passes for dinner, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the portable heating unit that somehow still functions, despite taking shrapnel 3 days ago. Around him, the field kitchen is a chaos of desperate activity. 5 other cooks work in the semi-darkness, their gas masks hanging loose around their necks, ready to be donned the moment the telltale hiss of chemical weapons drifts across the battlefield. The pot contains nutrient gruel, designation Garthar roast chicken flavor, though Melos has never tasted anything resembling chicken in his entire life. He's been doing this for 8 months now. 8 months since he was pulled from the processing lines of a corpse starch facility on his hive world and told he'd be feeding the Emperor's finest warriors. 8 months of learning that there are fates far worse than being processed into food yourself. Welcome to the grim darkness of the far future, where even those who feed the armies of mankind face horrors that would break lesser souls. Today, we're going to explore one of the most overlooked and utterly nightmarish roles in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe: the battlefield cook. These are the men and women tasked with the impossible job of keeping millions of Imperial Guardsmen fed across thousands of active war zones, using supplies that might be decades old, in conditions that would make the trenches of World War I look like a holiday resort. They work in makeshift kitchens mere kilometers from the front lines, preparing food from ingredients that come with health warnings, while enemy artillery turns the landscape around them into a cratered hellscape. They are not heroes. They will never be commemorated. Most of them will die anonymous deaths, their names lost in the incomprehensible bureaucracy of the Departamento Munitorum. But without them, the endless war machine of the Imperium would grind to a halt. In the year 40,000, humanity is locked in an eternal struggle for survival across 1 million worlds. The Imperial Guard, also known as the Astra Militarum, is the primary military force of the Imperium of Man. We're talking about an organization so vast that the Departamento Munitorum cannot even accurately count how many soldiers serve at any given time. The lists of new recruits and casualties can run into the millions in a single day. Every year, trillions of new soldiers are tithed into the Guard. If you lined up the entire Imperial Guard in a single column, it would stretch from Terror to Armageddon. And every single one of these soldiers needs to eat. This is where our battlefield cooks come in. These are not the skilled chefs you might imagine from a cushy military base. These are conscripts, often taken from the lowest dregs of Imperial society, thrown into one of the most thankless jobs in the galaxy. They are the ones who must take unappetizing rations with a shelf life measured in centuries and somehow make them edible enough that starving soldiers won't mutiny. The role of a battlefield cook in the Imperial Guard is simultaneously essential and utterly disposable. On one hand, an army cannot fight on an empty stomach, even in the grim darkness of the far future. Soldiers who are starving, dehydrated, or suffering from malnutrition make mistakes. They fall asleep on watch. They lack the strength to carry their lasguns through yet another forced march. They die easier. The Departamento Munitorum, for all its bureaucratic incompetence, understands this basic truth. Food must reach the front lines. Hot meals must be prepared. Soldiers must be fed. But on the other hand, cooks are not soldiers. Not really. They carry lasguns, yes, and they wear the same flak armor as any other guardsman, but they are not expected to be on the front lines. They are support personnel, part of the vast logistics network that keeps the Imperial war machine functioning. This means they occupy a strange middle ground in the military hierarchy. They are more expendable than combat troops because they can be replaced more easily. A dead cook means hungry soldiers, but hungry soldiers can still fight, at least for a while. A dead squad of infantry means a gap in the line that the enemy can exploit. The irony is crushing. Battlefield cooks in the 41st millennium face nearly the same mortality rates as frontline infantry, but they receive none of the glory. When a regiment is wiped out in a heroic last stand, their names might be carved into monuments. Their deeds might be recorded in the regimental histories. But the cooks who died trying to feed them, they are forgotten. Their bodies are processed into corpse starch, which will eventually be shipped to another war zone to feed another generation of soldiers. The cycle continues, endlessly, pointlessly, as it has for 10,000 years. This is the reality of being a battlefield cook in Warhammer 40K. You are trapped between the bureaucratic nightmare of the supply chain, the physical horrors of the battlefield, and the psychological torment of knowing that your work, no matter how hard you try, will never be enough. You will prepare meals from rations that are literally labeled with warnings about birth defects and heart failure. You will watch soldiers vomit up the food you prepared because it's been contaminated by chemicals drifting across the battlefield. You will see your fellow cooks torn apart by artillery fire, their bodies splattered across the very pots they were stirring moments before. And through it all, you will keep cooking. Because if you stop, if you hesitate, if you show even a moment of weakness, the commissar attached to your unit will execute you for dereliction of duty. Let's understand exactly how someone becomes a battlefield cook in the Imperial Guard. It's not a career path anyone chooses willingly. The Imperial Guard draws its soldiers from the tithes that every world in the Imperium must pay. Each planet is required to make available for recruitment 10% of its armed forces per year. These recruits are often taken from planetary defense forces, hive gang fighters, or in some desperate cases, simply rounded up from the population at large. When a recruiting officer from the Departamento Munitorum arrives on a world, they assess the available manpower and assign roles based on the needs of the Imperium. Most recruits become standard infantry, the humble guardsmen who form the backbone of the Imperial military. Some, if they show particular aptitude or come from specialized worlds, might be assigned to armored regiments, artillery units, or drop troops. And then, there are those deemed unsuitable for frontline combat, but still useful to the war effort. The weak, the sickly, those who failed basic combat assessments, but aren't quite incompetent enough to be rejected entirely. These unfortunates often find themselves assigned to logistics, and within logistics, to the field kitchens. The training for a battlefield cook, if you can even call it training, is minimal at best. On most worlds, recruits are given a few weeks of basic instruction in food preparation, mostly focused on operating the standard equipment issued to Imperial Guard field kitchens. They learn how to identify the various types of rations, how to operate portable heating units, how to calculate portions for a company of soldiers. They are taught the basics of food safety, though in practice, food safety in a war zone is more of a theoretical concept than an achievable goal. They learn how to preserve supplies in extreme conditions, how to stretch rations when shipments don't arrive, how to identify when food has been contaminated by chemical weapons or biological agents. Most importantly, they learn how to work fast, because in the Imperial Guard, efficiency is survival. A kitchen that can't keep up with demand is a kitchen that will be replaced, and replacement in the grim darkness of the far future often means summary execution for incompetence. The equipment issued to battlefield cooks is a study in brutal utilitarianism. The standard Imperial Guard field kitchen is a mobile unit designed to be transported by truck, or, in more desperate circumstances, dragged by draft animals or servitors. It consists of several large pots, each capable of holding enough gruel to feed 100 soldiers, mounted on portable heating units that can burn almost any fuel, from promethium to wood to, in the most desperate circumstances, rendered corpse fat. There are cutting boards, knives, ladles, serving utensils, all made from cheap metal that rusts quickly and needs constant maintenance. The entire setup can be assembled or disassembled in under an hour, a necessary feature when your position might come under artillery fire at any moment. The kitchen is usually sheltered under a tarp, or, if the regiment is lucky, inside a partially intact building. but protection from the elements is never guaranteed. Cooks work in rain, snow, toxic fog, and scorching heat because the soldiers need to eat regardless of conditions. In addition to the cooking equipment, each cook is issued a standard guardsman's kit. A laser gun, because everyone in the Imperial Guard is expected to fight if necessary. Flak armor, though cooks often remove parts of it when working over hot pots because the heat is unbearable. A gas mask, essential in war zones where chemical weapons are common. A bedroll, a mess kit, a water canteen, and a small allowance of personal items. The irony is that cooks carry the same basic equipment as frontline infantry, but are expected to use it far less. The laser gun is more for show than actual use, at least until the enemy breaches your position and you find yourself fighting hand-to-hand in the ruins of your kitchen. The flak armor will stop las fire and shrapnel, but it won't save you from an artillery shell or a collapsing building. And the gas mask, while theoretically capable of filtering out most toxins, has a limited lifespan and might not protect you from the more exotic chemical weapons deployed by chaos cultists or alien xenos. Still, it's better than nothing. And in the grim darkness of the far future, better than nothing is often the best you can hope for. Once a cook has completed their minimal training and been issued their equipment, they are assigned to a regiment. This is where the real horror begins. The Imperial Guard is organized into countless regiments, each drawn from a different world, each with its own culture, traditions, and methods of warfare. A cook might find themselves assigned to a Cadian shock trooper regiment, disciplined and professional, with a relatively organized supply chain. Or they might end up with a death cause of Krieg regiment, where the soldiers view death as a glorious sacrifice and have little regard for anything other than complete obedience. They might serve with Katakan jungle fighters who prefer to forage for their own food and view standard rations with contempt. Or they could be attached to a Vostroyan firstborn regiment, where tradition and honor matter more than survival. Each assignment brings its own challenges, its own dangers, its own peculiar form of suffering. And once assigned, a cook is stuck with that regiment for the duration of their service, which in the Imperial Guard usually means until death. Now let's talk about the food itself, because this is where the true horror of being a battlefield cook becomes apparent. The primary ration issued to Imperial Guard regiments is nutrient gruel, a grey porridge-like substance that comes in tins designed for easy field consumption. According to official Departamento Munitorum documentation, these rations have a shelf life of 160 standard years. Yes, you read that correctly. The food you are preparing might be older than the soldiers eating it. Each tin is labeled with one of 16 ready-to-eat flavors. Names like Gartha roast chicken, Porphyrian pork, Synth meat delight, and other designations that bear no resemblance whatsoever to the actual contents. Open any tin and you'll find the same semi-solidified grey sludge, the same texture, the same faint chemical smell. The flavors are purely theoretical, a product of whatever food coloring and artificial scent was added during processing decades ago. The nutrient gruel is nutritionally complete, at least according to the Administratum standards. It contains all the proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins and minerals that a fighting member of the Astra Militarum theoretically needs to survive. However, and this is crucial, guardsmen are warned against making nutrient gruel their sole source of sustenance for longer than 5 consecutive days. Doing so can lead to adverse effects such as headaches, stomach upset, birth defects, and heart failure. Let that sink in for a moment. The standard military ration of the Imperial Guard is so inadequate that eating it for more than 5 days straight can cause permanent damage to your body. And yet, for many regiments deployed to long-term war zones, nutrient gruel is all they have. There are no fresh vegetables, no real meat, no variety whatsoever. Just tin after tin of grey sludge, each labelled with increasingly absurd flavour names that mock the very concept of real food. But nutrient gruel is not the only source of nutrition available to the Imperial Guard. There's also corpse starch. And here we enter territory so grim that even by Warhammer 40K standards, it stands out. Corpse starch is exactly what it sounds like. A synthetic food source created from the recycled human dead of the Imperium's hive cities. On hive worlds like Necromunda, millions of people are born and die each solar day. Without the orderly disposal of their corpses, plague and disease would run rampant. So the bodies are collected by the Corpse Guild, rendered down in great corpse grinder plants, and processed into a grey paste that is then pressed into crackers, loaves, or nutrient blocks. This material is then distributed throughout the Imperium, including to military forces, where it serves as a cheap and readily available source of protein. In some places within the Imperium, it is considered overtly seditious conduct to express disgust in response to the weird taste of corpse starch. For a battlefield cook, the knowledge that you might be preparing food made from rendered human corpses is just one more weight on your already burdened conscience. The corpse starch arrives in unmarked crates, mixed in with other supplies, and you're expected to incorporate it into meals without comment. You boil it into soups. You mix it with nutrient gruel to add texture. You bake it into hard bread that soldiers can carry in their packs. And you try very hard not to think about where it came from. The truly horrifying part is that corpse starch, for all its grim origins, is often considered superior to standard nutrient gruel by soldiers who have eaten both. It has more texture, a slightly less chemical taste, and when prepared properly, can almost approximate real food. Some regiments, particularly those drawn from hive worlds where corpse starch consumption is normal, actively prefer it. They'll trade other rations for extra corpse starch, viewing it as a taste of home. And you, the cook, must accommodate these preferences while quietly dying inside. Beyond nutrient gruel and corpse starch, there are other rations available, though their distribution is inconsistent at best. Grok's meat is common, or at least as common as anything can be in the Imperial Guard. Groks are large, aggressive livestock animals native to multiple worlds across the Imperium. They're described as temperamental beasts that need to be lobotomized to be safely handled, but their meat is nutritious and can be processed into everything from steaks to sausages to dried jerky. When a supply shipment actually includes Grok's meat, it's considered a blessing by both cooks and soldiers. Real meat, even from a creature as unpleasant as a Grok's, is infinitely preferable to processed rations. The problem is that Grok's meat is expensive to transport and spoils relatively quickly without proper refrigeration. Most regiments only receive it as an occasional supplement, usually before major offensives, when the command staff wants to boost morale. Then there are the agri-world exports, the actual food grown on agricultural planets across the Imperium. Wheat for bread, vegetables, though usually dried or canned, fruit, an almost unimaginable luxury for most guardsmen, amasec and other alcoholic beverages, distributed in carefully rationed amounts. These supplies are theoretically part of the regular logistics chain, shipped from agri-worlds to war zones as needed. In practice, they almost never arrive in sufficient quantities. The Departamento Munitorum is a vast bureaucratic nightmare, and the logistics of moving food supplies through the warp to reach millions of soldiers scattered across thousands of planets is nearly impossible. Ships get lost. Supplies are redirected to other war zones. Entire shipments spoil in transit, and when fresh food does arrive, it's often reserved for officers and specialized units, with only the dregs trickling down to the regular soldiers and the cooks who serve them. As a battlefield cook, your daily routine is dictated by the rhythm of war. In a typical deployment, assuming there is such a thing as typical in the Imperial Guard, you wake before dawn. Sleep is something you steal in short bursts, never more than a few hours at a time, because the kitchen operates on a constant schedule. Soldiers need breakfast before the morning assault. They need lunch when they rotate off the line. They need dinner after the day's fighting, assuming they're still alive. Your day begins with inventory. You check the supplies that arrived overnight, assuming any arrived at all. You count the tins of nutrient gruel, noting how many are dented, how many show signs of age beyond even their already impressive shelf life. You examine the corpse starch, looking for signs of spoilage or infestation. You check the water supply, testing it for contamination, because water sources near battlefields are often poisoned, deliberately or through the simple accumulation of chemical runoff, decaying bodies, and industrial waste. Once inventory is complete, you begin preparation for the first meal. This involves heating massive pots of water, opening dozens or hundreds of ration tins, and mixing everything together into a barely edible slurry. The exact recipe varies depending on what supplies are available, but the goal is always the same. Create enough food to feed your assigned soldiers while using as few resources as possible, because you never know when the next shipment will arrive. You add whatever supplements you can scavenge or trade for. Salt, if you have it, to make the gruel less bland. Herbs or spices, if you're incredibly lucky. Sometimes you'll add rendered fat from previous meals to increase the caloric content. Every cook develops their own tricks, their own methods for making the rations slightly more palatable. These techniques are passed down through word of mouth, an informal tradition in the otherwise rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Guard. While the food cooks, you must constantly monitor it, stirring to prevent burning, adjusting the heat, adding water as it evaporates. This is dangerous work. The pots are massive and filled with boiling liquid. A moment of carelessness, a slip on muddy ground, a sudden explosion nearby that causes you to stumble, and you can be scolded by contents hot enough to melt flesh from bone. Burns are one of the most common injuries among battlefield cooks, and medical supplies for non-combat injuries are always limited. You wrap the burned skin in whatever bandages are available, apply whatever ointment you can scrounge, and continue working, because there's no time to rest. The soldiers are waiting. The commissar is watching. Any sign of weakness will be noted and punished. When the food is ready, you begin serving. The soldiers line up with their mess kits, and you ladle out portions of the grey sludge you've created. Some soldiers thank you. Most don't. A few complain, loudly, about the quality of the food, as if you have any control over what supplies arrive. You nod, accept their complaints, and keep serving, because arguing with soldiers is a quick way to find yourself on the wrong end of a fight you cannot win. You serve hundreds of soldiers, sometimes thousands, depending on the size of your regiment and how many cooks are in your unit. The line seems endless. Your arms ache from lifting the heavy ladle over and over. Your back screams from standing in one position for hours. Your feet, encased in boots that never quite fit right, throb with pain. And when the last soldier has been served, when you finally have a moment to rest, you realize that it's time to start preparing the next meal. Between meals, there are other duties. Cleaning the pots and utensils, a never-ending task in an environment where sanitation is nearly impossible. Repairing equipment that's constantly breaking down from overuse and poor maintenance. Organizing supplies, rotating stock so that the oldest rations are used first. And always, watching the horizon for the next supply convoy, hoping it will arrive before your current stocks run out. The fear of running out of food is constant. It hangs over every cook like a dark cloud. If the soldiers go hungry, if they riot because there's nothing to eat, you will be held responsible. The officers will blame you. The commissar will blame you. And in the grim darkness of the far future, being blamed can mean execution. You've seen it happen to other cooks, men and women who did everything right but were still shot because the supply chain failed and someone needed to be punished. The environmental conditions you work in are beyond brutal. Imagine trying to cook in a war zone where the very air might be toxic. Chemical weapons are common in the 41st Millennium, deployed by both Imperial forces and their enemies. Nerve gas, blister agents, choking agents, exotic toxins created by alien xenos or chaos cultists. When the warning sirens sound, you have seconds to don your gas mask before the cloud drifts over your position. But you can't stop cooking. The soldiers still need to eat. So you work with the mask on, your vision restricted, your breathing labored, the straps cutting into your face as you try to see through fogged lenses. The heat from the cooking pots combines with the restricted airflow of the mask, to create a suffocating hell. You gasp for air that tastes of rubber and your own sweat. Your head pounds, your lungs burn, but you keep stirring, keep serving, keep working, because stopping means death. Artillery bombardment is another constant threat. The Imperial Guard fights wars of attrition, grinding campaigns where artillery barrages can last for days or weeks without pause. When your position comes under fire, there's no time to seek shelter. The food is cooking, the soldiers are waiting, and if you abandon your post, you'll be shot for cowardice. So you stay in the kitchen, even as the ground shakes from nearby impacts, even as shrapnel whistles through the air, even as buildings collapse around you. You watch your fellow cooks die. You see a man you've worked beside for months, torn apart by an explosion, his blood mixing with the gruel he was preparing. You see a woman crushed when the roof of the makeshift kitchen collapses. You see injuries that medical personnel don't have time to treat because they're too busy with wounded combat soldiers. And through it all, you keep working, because in the Imperial Guard, you are expendable. Your life means nothing. Only the mission matters. The psychological toll of being a battlefield cook is immense. You are surrounded by death, but unlike frontline soldiers, you don't have the adrenaline of combat to distract you. You see the bodies, you see the wounded, you hear the screams, and you know that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, it might be you. Sleep deprivation is constant. The nightmares when you do sleep are worse. You dream of burning alive in your own kitchen. You dream of being buried under collapsed buildings. You dream of the commissar's pistol pressed against your head as you're executed for some imagined failure. You wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, and immediately begin preparing the next meal because there's no time to process your trauma. In the grim darkness of the far future, mental health is not a concern. You either cope or you break, and if you break, you die. Let's talk about what happens when supplies don't arrive on time, because this is one of the most common and terrifying scenarios a battlefield cook faces. The Imperial Guard's supply chain is a nightmare of incompetence, corruption, and simple bad luck. Ships carrying supplies might be delayed in the warp, taking months or years longer than planned to reach their destination. They might be attacked by pirates or Xenos raiders and destroyed. They might deliver their cargo to the wrong planet because of a clerical error, somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Departamento Munitorum. When this happens, when the supplies you were counting on simply don't show up, you're left with a terrible choice. You can stretch your existing supplies, cutting rations, and hoping the soldiers don't mutiny when their portions shrink. You can try to forage for local food, assuming the planet you're on has anything edible and hasn't been completely poisoned by the war. Or you can do what many desperate cooks have done before you. Start improvising with whatever organic material is available and pray no one asks too many questions about where the meat in tonight's stew actually came from. The Departamento Munitorum, the vast bureaucratic organization responsible for supplying the Imperial Guard, is a special kind of hell for anyone who has to deal with it. In theory, it's supposed to coordinate the movement of supplies from across the Imperium to wherever they're needed. In practice, it's a labyrinth of red tape, corruption, and staggering incompetence that would be comedic if the consequences weren't so deadly. Requisition forms get lost. Orders are filled incorrectly. A regiment asks for rations and receives ammunition. Another asks for ammunition and receives latrines. Sometimes supplies arrive for regiments that have been dead for decades. The bureaucracy so slow that it hasn't caught up with the fact that the recipients no longer exist. And through all this chaos, battlefield cooks must somehow keep their soldiers fed. Let me paint you a picture of just how bad the supply situation can get. During the siege of Vrax, a brutal campaign that lasted for years, the logistics of supplying the attacking Imperial forces became a nightmare of epic proportions. It took a full year of logistical preparation before troops even began landing. Millions of artillery shells were stockpiled. Rations were accumulated in vast quantities. And despite all this planning, despite the year of preparation, supply shortages were constant throughout the campaign. Units would go days without resupply. Water became so scarce that soldiers died of dehydration. Food ran out, and regiments were forced to stretch their rations to breaking point. The battlefield cooks during Vrax worked in conditions that defy description. They prepared meals under constant artillery bombardment, in trenches filled with mud and corpses, using water contaminated by chemical runoff. Many died. Most were forgotten. But the war ground on, and new cooks were brought in to replace those who fell, because the machine must be fed. Corruption within the supply chain is rampant. Officers and logistics personnel often skim the best supplies for themselves, selling them on black markets that exist even in the most regimented Imperial Guard deployments. A shipment meant to contain 1,000 tins of rations might arrive with only 700, the rest stolen and sold. Fresh food intended for a regiment might never make it past the supply depot, ending up instead in the private kitchens of generals and commissars. Battlefield cooks see this happen constantly. They watch as supplies are diverted, as the quality of what they receive degrades, as quantities shrink. There's nothing they can do about it. Complaining to a superior officer is pointless at best and dangerous at worst. You might find yourself transferred to a penal legion or simply shot for questioning the integrity of your commanders. So you accept the reality. You work with what you're given. You make meals from scraps and try not to think about where the missing supplies went. The relationships between battlefield cooks and the soldiers they serve are complex and often fraught. On one hand, every soldier knows that the cooks are essential. Without food, the army cannot function. Hunger breaks morale faster than enemy fire. A well-fed soldier is more alert, more capable, more willing to follow orders. So there's a baseline level of appreciation for the cooks, even if it's rarely expressed. But on the other hand, the food is often so terrible that soldiers direct their frustration at the people preparing it. Cooks become scapegoats for every problem in the supply chain. When the rations run out, it's the cook's fault for not managing them better. When the food makes soldiers sick, it's the cook's fault for poor preparation. Never mind that the ingredients were contaminated before they even arrived. When morale is low, soldiers blame the cooks for not making better meals, as if they have access to anything other than grey sludge and corpse starch. There are rare moments when the relationship between cooks and soldiers takes on a different character. After a particularly brutal battle, when casualties have been high and survivors are dealing with the trauma of watching their friends die, a hot meal can be a small comfort. In those moments, soldiers might actually thank their cooks. They might share a joke, tell a story, acknowledge the shared humanity that exists even in the grim darkness of the far future. A cook who can provide something approaching decent food during these moments can earn real respect from their regiment. But these moments are fleeting. Tomorrow, the war continues. Tomorrow, the rations will still be terrible. Tomorrow, someone will complain, and the cycle begins again. The presence of commissars adds another layer of terror to a cook's daily life. Commissars are the political officers of the Imperial Guard, responsible for maintaining discipline and loyalty within regiments. They have absolute authority to execute anyone they deem guilty of cowardice, heresy, or dereliction of duty. For a battlefield cook, this means living under constant threat. Burn a meal, and you might be accused of sabotage. Run out of supplies, and you might be accused of incompetence. Show any sign of despair or hopelessness, and you might be accused of spreading defeatism. The commissar's bolt pistol is always present, holstered but ready. A reminder that your life could end at any moment if you fail to meet expectations. Some commissars are relatively understanding, recognizing that cooks are working with limited resources in impossible conditions. Others are brutal martinets who execute cooks for the smallest infractions, believing that terror is the only way to maintain efficiency. You never know which type you'll get until it's too late. Let's explore what being a battlefield cook looks like in specific types of war zones, because the Imperium fights wars on every type of planet imaginable, and each presents unique challenges. In siege warfare, like the infamous campaigns on Vrax or in the trenches of Krieg-style conflicts, battlefield cooks operate in relatively static positions. The front lines don't move much, which means your kitchen can be semi-permanent, set up in a reinforced bunker or fortified building. This sounds like an advantage, and in some ways it is. You have more protection from enemy fire. You can stockpile supplies. You can establish routines. But siege warfare has its own horrors. The constant artillery bombardment means that even reinforced positions aren't safe. The enemy knows where your supply lines are and specifically targets them. Trenches fill with water during rain, turning your kitchen into a mud-filled pit where everything is wet and nothing ever dries. Disease spreads rapidly in these conditions. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, all thrive in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of trench warfare. As a cook, you're expected to maintain food safety standards that are simply impossible to achieve. You boil water, but the water source itself is contaminated. You wash your utensils, but there's nowhere clean to store them. Soldiers eat their meals and immediately fall ill, and you're blamed for poisoning them, even though you did everything possible with the resources available. Jungle warfare presents a completely different set of challenges. Regiments like the Katakan jungle fighters operate in dense, hostile environments where standard supply chains often can't reach them. In these conditions, foraging becomes essential. As a cook, you're expected to identify local plants and animals that are safe to eat, a nearly impossible task on alien worlds where the wildlife hasn't been properly catalogued. Katachans have the advantage of being trained from birth in their jungle environment, but most cooks come from hive worlds or agricultural planets and have no idea what's edible and what will kill you. Trial and error becomes the method of learning, and errors are often fatal. You might prepare a meal from local vegetation, only to discover that it contains slow-acting neurotoxins. You might hunt local wildlife, cook it thoroughly, and serve it to your soldiers, only to watch them collapse as parasites or alien bacteria overwhelm their systems. The Katakans, when forced to work with cooks from other worlds, often bypass them entirely, preferring to handle their own food rather than trust someone they view as incompetent. This might sound like an insult, but it's actually a mercy. It means you have fewer soldiers to feed, fewer mouths demanding food you can't provide. Desert warfare brings its own nightmares, centered primarily around water. In a desert environment, water becomes more valuable than ammunition. Soldiers can ration food, eating less to make supplies last, but they cannot ration water beyond a certain point. Dehydration kills quickly in extreme heat, and dead soldiers are useless. As a battlefield cook in a desert war zone, your primary job shifts from preparing food to managing water supplies. You must ensure that every drop is accounted for. You must boil water to kill pathogens, even though boiling in desert heat is almost unbearable. You must prevent waste, ration portions precisely, and somehow keep soldiers hydrated enough to fight. The food itself becomes almost secondary. You prepare meals that require minimal water to cook. Dried rations, corpse starch crackers, anything that can be eaten without additional preparation. When you do cook, you use every bit of moisture, recycling it wherever possible. You learn to cook in the cool hours before dawn, when the heat is slightly less oppressive. And you watch soldiers die anyway, their bodies shutting down from heat stroke and dehydration, despite your best efforts. Urban warfare might seem easier. Cities have infrastructure, buildings that can shelter your kitchen, and potentially local food sources. But urban combat zones are some of the most dangerous environments in the Imperium. Buildings collapse without warning from artillery strikes or structural damage. Ambushes are constant because the enemy can hide anywhere. Snipers target anyone who shows themselves, and a cook working over a pot is an easy target. The infrastructure that should make your job easier is usually destroyed or booby-trapped. Water systems are poisoned. Gas lines rupture and fill buildings with toxic fumes. And the population, if any civilians remain, are often starving and desperate, willing to kill for a single tin of rations. You cook in the ruins, setting up your equipment in bombed-out buildings, and try to stay alert for threats from every direction. Enemy soldiers, desperate civilians, your own soldiers, some of whom might consider taking the supplies by force if things get bad enough. Urban warfare is chaos, and battlefield cooks are just trying to survive one more day in that chaos. Ice worlds, like Valhalla or other frozen death worlds, present yet another unique challenge. The cold is relentless. Standard cooking equipment doesn't function well in sub-zero temperatures. Water freezes instantly if you don't keep it heated. Supplies become brittle and difficult to work with. You burn an enormous amount of fuel just to keep your cooking pots from freezing solid. The soldiers need high-calorie meals to maintain body temperature, but the supplies you receive are the same standard rations used everywhere else, inadequate for the caloric demands of extreme cold. You supplement with whatever local wildlife can be hunted, usually some form of hardy, aggressive creature adapted to the frozen environment. Preparing these creatures is dangerous. They're often diseased or contaminated with environmental toxins. But you have no choice. The soldiers must eat, and standard rations alone won't keep them alive in the cold. The mental and physical toll of being a battlefield cook accumulates over time. The human body was not meant to function under the conditions you face daily. Sleep deprivation becomes chronic. Studies of military personnel have shown that sustained sleep deprivation leads to impaired judgment, slower reaction times, and eventually hallucinations and psychosis. In the Imperial Guard, there is no respite. You work 18 to 20-hour days, sleep for a few fitful hours, and then wake to do it all again. Your mind begins to fracture. You find yourself making mistakes, forgetting steps in food preparation, losing track of inventory. These mistakes can be fatal, either because they result in contaminated food that sickens soldiers, or because the commissar notices and decides you're incompetent. You try to stay sharp through sheer force of will, but will alone isn't enough. Eventually, everyone breaks. The only question is how you break and whether you survive it. The physical injuries accumulate as well. Burns from cooking equipment, cuts from knives and sharp edges, broken bones from slips and falls in treacherous terrain, shrapnel wounds from near-miss artillery strikes, respiratory damage from inhaling toxic fumes, hearing loss from constant exposure to explosions. Your hands become scarred and calloused. Your back develops chronic pain from lifting heavy pots and supplies. You develop vitamin deficiencies because you're so focused on feeding the soldiers that you forget to feed yourself properly. And there's rarely adequate medical care. The regimental medici are overwhelmed with combat casualties. They don't have time for a cook with a burned hand or a sprained ankle. You wrap it yourself, take whatever pain medication you can find, and continue working. The Imperial Guard does not care about your comfort or your health. It cares only about your function. As long as you can still cook, you will cook. When you can't anymore, you'll be replaced. The guilt is another weight that crushes you slowly. As a battlefield cook, you witness death constantly, but you're not actively participating in combat. You're not the one pulling the trigger. You're just trying to keep people fed. But you know, in your heart, that the food you're preparing is inadequate. You know that soldiers are going malnourished despite eating their full rations. You know that the warnings on the nutrient gruel tins about birth defects and heart failure are real, and that you're slowly poisoning the people you're supposed to be supporting. You watch young soldiers, barely more than children, eat the slop you've prepared and try to smile, try to be grateful, even though you can see in their eyes that they're struggling to keep it down. And you wonder if there's anything more you could do, any way you could make it better. The answer is almost always no. You're working with what you have. But the guilt doesn't care about logic. It accumulates day after day, meal after meal, until you can barely look at yourself. There are moments, rare and precious, when something approaching humanity breaks through the horror. A soldier who genuinely thanks you for a meal. a successful scavenging mission that allows you to add real vegetables to the gruel. A shipment that arrives early and actually contains what was requisitioned. These moments don't erase the suffering, but they provide just enough hope to keep going. You remember why you took this job, even if you didn't have a choice. You remember that somewhere, buried under the layers of trauma and exhaustion, you once believed that feeding people mattered, that keeping soldiers alive was important, that your work, however humble, served the Emperor and contributed to humanity's survival. These thoughts are fragile things, easily shattered by the next crisis, but they're all you have. Some cooks develop coping mechanisms that help them endure. Dark humor is common. Jokes about the food, about death, about the absurdity of the situation. Gallows humor that would horrify civilians but makes perfect sense when you're living in hell. Some form bonds with other cooks, creating informal support networks where you can share techniques, trade supplies, and simply talk to someone who understands what you're going through. These friendships are intense and often short-lived because death is always close, but while they last, they provide a lifeline. Some cooks turn to faith, praying to the God Emperor for strength, for protection, for meaning in the suffering. The Imperial Creed teaches that suffering has purpose, that through hardship, you prove your worth to the Emperor. Whether this is true or just another lie told to keep the masses compliant is irrelevant. What matters is that belief helps some people endure, others cope less healthily. Substance abuse is rampant in the Imperial Guard. Alcohol, when available, is consumed to excess. Some soldiers and support personnel turn to more dangerous substances, narcotics traded on the black markets that exist in every major deployment. For a cook, the temptation is constant. You have access to supplies. You can trade extra rations for drugs or alcohol. You can numb yourself to the horror, at least temporarily. But this path leads nowhere good. Addiction makes you vulnerable. It impairs your judgment. It gives the commissar an excuse to execute you for compromising the regiment's effectiveness. Some cooks go down this path anyway, deciding that a short life lived in chemical oblivion is preferable to years of sober suffering. The statistics surrounding Imperial Guard casualties are almost incomprehensible. Estimates suggest that somewhere around 10 million Guard soldiers die every hour across the countless battlefields of the Imperium. 10 million human beings, each with their own thoughts, fears, and dreams, snuffed out in 60 minutes. At that scale, individual deaths become meaningless. You stop being a person and become a statistic, a number to be recorded and forgotten. Battlefield cooks fall into a strange category within these statistics. They're not classified as combat troops, so their deaths don't count the same way in official records. When a cook is killed, it's logged as a logistics casualty, if it's logged at all. The Departamento Munitorum might not even know you're dead for months or years, because the bureaucracy is so vast and slow that information takes forever to propagate. Your family, if you had one before being conscripted, will probably never learn what happened to you. They'll simply receive a form letter stating that you died in service to the Emperor, with no details, no recognition, no compensation. The life expectancy of an Imperial Guardsman is notoriously short, with dark jokes suggesting that the average life expectancy after entering a war zone is measured in hours for some regiments. Battlefield cooks don't fare much better. While they're not on the absolute front lines, they're close enough that artillery, airstrikes, raids, and random acts of violence kill them regularly. A study of casualty rates, if such a study could even be conducted in the chaotic record-keeping of the Imperium, would probably show that cooks have a median survival time of a few months in active war zones. Some die in their first week. A lucky few might last a year or more, but almost none survive long enough to complete a standard tour of duty and be rotated out. The Imperial Guard doesn't rotate personnel. You serve until you die, or until your regiment is so depleted that it's disbanded. There is no going home. There is no retirement. There is only war, and war consumes everyone eventually. The replacement machine is efficient and merciless. When a cook dies, a new one is brought in to fill the position. The new cook is given minimal orientation. Here's the equipment. Here's the supply schedule. Here's how many soldiers you need to feed. Figure the rest out yourself. If you're lucky, there's another experienced cook who can show you the ropes. If you're not, you learn through trial and errors in the Imperial Guard are punished harshly. The machine doesn't care about your learning curve. It doesn't care that you're terrified or inexperienced or completely out of your depth. It needs meals prepared on schedule, and if you can't do that, it will find someone who can. This creates a brutal Darwinian environment where only the most adaptable, the most resilient, or simply the luckiest survive long enough to become competent. Everyone else dies, and new recruits take their place, continuing the cycle. Being forgotten in death might actually be a mercy. The alternative is being remembered for the wrong reasons. A cook who makes a catastrophic mistake, who accidentally poisons a company of soldiers with contaminated food, who fails to properly manage supplies and causes a mutiny, might find their name recorded as an example of incompetence or treachery. These names are used in training materials, cautionary tales about what happens when you fail. Your legacy becomes a warning to others. Is that better or worse than simply disappearing into the vast anonymity of imperial bureaucracy? There's no good answer. Both options are equally bleak. You die unknown and unremembered, or you die infamous and reviled. Those are your choices. Let's be clear about something. Battlefield cooks in the 41st millennium are not heroes. They're not going to have statues erected in their honor. They're not going to inspire songs or legends. They're not even going to be acknowledged by the very soldiers they keep alive. But they are necessary. The Imperial Guard is the hammer of the Emperor, the vast military force that stands between humanity and extinction. And hammers need to be fed. Without the cooks, without the endless, thankless, horrifying work of preparing meals in war zones, the whole system collapses. Soldiers don't fight well when they're starving. They don't follow orders when hunger overrides discipline. Entire regiments could mutiny, could turn to chaos or Xenos collaboration, simply because they weren't fed adequately. The Imperium understands this. That's why battlefield cooks exist. That's why they're subjected to these conditions. Because someone must do this work, and in the grim darkness of the far future, the people who do it are considered acceptable losses. The horror of being a battlefield cook is the horror of being trapped in a system that doesn't value you as a person, only as a function. You are a tool, as disposable as any other piece of equipment. When you break, you're discarded. There's no pension, no retirement, no reward for faithful service. There's only the next meal to prepare, the next batch of supplies to inventory, the next day to survive. And through it all, you must maintain some semblance of dignity, some core of self that remembers you were once human, even as the Imperium treats you as nothing more than a cog in its vast machine. This is the true darkness at the heart of Warhammer 40K. It's not the demons or the aliens or the ancient evils lurking in the void. It's the casual, systematic dehumanization of billions of people, ground up in the gears of an empire that claims to be protecting humanity while destroying the very thing that makes us human. Picture this scene in your mind. A battlefield cook, exhausted beyond measure, standing over a pot of boiling gruel. The sky above is choked with smoke from burning hab blocks. Artillery rumbles in the distance, a constant thunder that never stops. His hands are scarred and burned. His back aches. He hasn't slept properly in days. Around him, other cooks work in silence, too tired to speak, too numb to feel anything but the mechanical need to complete their tasks. Soldiers line up, young men and women who will likely be dead within the week, holding out their mess kits for a portion of food that might sicken them, might be contaminated, might be their last meal. The cook ladles out the gruel, portion after portion, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice asks, "Is this all there is? Is this all I'll ever be?" There's no answer to that question, no comfort to be found. He keeps working because that's all he can do, because stopping means death, and some part of him, despite everything, still clings to survival. He finishes serving the line, cleans the pot, prepares for the next meal, and the cycle continues, will continue, forever, or until he dies, whichever comes first. This is the life of a battlefield cook in Warhammer 40K. This is the horror that the setting rarely shows, but is always present. The forgotten, the overlooked, the people who keep the machine running while being slowly destroyed by it. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and war needs to be fed. The cooks who do this feeding are ghosts, barely acknowledged even as they perform essential work. They live in a hell of their own, distinct from, but parallel to the hell of frontline combat. They suffer injuries, trauma, and death at rates that would be considered atrocities in any sane society. And they do it all while knowing that their sacrifice will never be recognized, never be honored, never be remembered. They are the invisible servants of the Emperor's war machine, ground down and spit out by a system that has no room for compassion or mercy. If you ever wondered what true hopelessness looks like, look no further than the face of an Imperial Guard battlefield cook, preparing yet another pot of grey sludge while artillery falls around them and the bodies pile higher. This is the reality that Games Workshop has created, a setting so thoroughly grimdark that even the people whose only job is to cook food are subjected to unimaginable suffering. It's a testament to the depth of the Warhammer 40K universe that these roles exist, that even the logistics and support personnel are characterized by horror and despair. It's also a reminder that in any military conflict, real or fictional, there are always people in the background doing essential work that goes unnoticed. The difference is that in our world, we can at least pretend that these people's lives have value, that their service is appreciated, that there's some meaning to their sacrifice. In the 41st millennium, even that small comfort is stripped away. You serve, you suffer, you die, and no one cares. So the next time you see artwork of heroic space marines, or read about the glorious victories of the Imperial Guard, take a moment to remember the battlefield cooks. Remember the men and women who never fire a shot in anger, but die anyway. Remember those who spend their short lives trying to keep others alive, using tools and ingredients that are themselves slowly killing everyone. Remember that in a galaxy of endless war, someone has to feed the soldiers, and that someone pays a price that is never acknowledged. They are the forgotten dead of the Imperium, the casualties who don't even merit a footnote in the histories. And in being forgotten, they represent the ultimate horror of Warhammer 40K, that in a galaxy of trillions, every single life is meaningless, expendable, and ultimately lost to the void of time and bureaucracy. Thank you for taking this journey with me into one of the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40K universe. If you found this exploration interesting and want to see more deep dives into the overlooked aspects of the grim darkness of the far future, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more forgotten roles and terrible fates to explore in this universe where there is only war. The battlefield cook is just one example of the countless ways that the Imperium consumes human lives and spits out broken shells. Understanding these stories gives us a fuller picture of just how thoroughly horrifying life in the 41st millennium truly is, how the casual cruelty extends to every level of society, every role, every person. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even those who only wanted to feed others will find nothing but suffering and death.